what it means to be me.
Welcome everybody to the first workshop of our Freedom Dreams fall series, Transformation on Our Own Terms. So I want to talk a little bit about Freedom Dreams because we're a new initiative. We are an online and place-based workshop series, and our dream is to share knowledge about the history and the current day experiences of BIPOC folk in the cooperative movement. And our big dream is to encourage and support communities of color in forming cooperative businesses that benefit and enrich their communities and also contribute to increasing justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in Canada's co-op sector. So over the course of these fall workshops, you'll learn about the histories and current experiences of cooperation among communities, not only here in Canada, but around the globe. So Freedom Dreams, we have two goals. So what we want to do is we want to empower participants with knowledge about the histories and experiences of cooperation among the BIPOC diaspora. This is a space for both BIPOC and allies, but specifically for allies, this is important so that we can see ourselves reflected in the co-op movement. And our other goal is to equip participants with the tools to ideate, launch, and operate cooperative businesses so that those reflections can become realities. So allow us to introduce ourselves. My name is Clarke. I'm the founder and facilitator of Freedom Dreams. I reside in Guelph, Ontario, which is the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and the Attawandaron. And I'd like to uplift one other acknowledgement. I am Iris's daughter, and that is very important to understanding the woman that I am. And I'm also an organic farmer as well as a cooperator. And I will pass it over to Susanna, who will introduce herself.
Thank you, Christine. So yes, hi and welcome. My name is Susanna Redekop. I am living here in Toronto, Ontario, traditional lands, the Mississauga, the First Credit, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Métis, among many other nations. And I'm an adopted daughter of diasporic nations. My background is Chinese, Venezuelan, Trinidadian, and Creole. And I was raised here in Toronto. I will get into it a little bit later, but also I work for the local food and farm co-ops, which is where I also know Christine from, because we're very lucky to have her as a board member. Yeah, back over to you, Christine.
Thanks, Susanna. So at the top of this meeting, we had everyone's right in the chat where they're from. And yes, thank you, Greer. We want everyone to give us a bit more information about yourselves. So in the chat, why don't you add your name, your pronouns, your location, and you'll notice that a few folks, including Susanna and myself, we acknowledge the original inhabitants of the regions that we reside in. So if you know that, put it in the chat. If you don't know it, I encourage you to visit that link, and I'm just going to drop it in the chat here, nativeland.ca, native-land.ca. And this is a digital map that charts the original inhabitants of occupied territory in Canada. So if you don't know the name, please visit that link, and all you have to do is type in where you are, and it will give you information on the original inhabitants. Also, if you are comfortable, uplift one other acknowledgement. I acknowledge my mom. Susanna acknowledged being the adopted daughter of many cultures. So yeah, one other acknowledgement, something that tells us a little something about you. Throw that in the chat as well. Meg Ronson's uplifting that she identifies as a highly sensitive person. Greer wants to acknowledge the history of cooperatives in this territory. Hi, Rachel. Thanks for joining us in Blackfoot land. they, them pronouns. Give folks one more minute if they're on native land, taking a look at the digital map and where the inhabitants of the region. Eric lives on the territories of the Wabanaki Confederacy on the traditional lands of the Micmac. We have Heather on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee. Welcome Judith, worked in co-op housing for 14 years and is from Guelph. And Thomas is uplifting his Mennonite heritage. Thank you, everybody. Keep writing where you're from and uplifting both those acknowledgements in the chat. And I'm just gonna move to talking about today's workshop. So today's workshop is transformation on our own terms. And it's taking a look at BIPOC-led co-ops, both historically and currently. Solutions for us and by us has been the cornerstone of cooperative work among BIPOC communities. We often find ourselves marginalized by mainstream institutions. And so alternatives to the mainstream become strategies of both survival and resistance for our community. So we're going to look at how co-ops as a model has empowered alternative forms of community economic development. But before we get into the nuts and bolts, I'm going to turn it over to Susanna, who's going to lead us in a grounding exercise to just get us centered for this discussion that we're going to have today.
Thank you, Christine. So before we get into today's topic, let's ground ourselves in this space. The 3 breaths grounding exercise, this is an invitation to breathe together. And although it calls for 3 breaths, take as many as you like at your own pace, eyes opened or closed. So we're going to start. With the first breath, breathe in, breathe deeply, simply notice your inhale and exhale and feel your chest rise and fall. In the second breath, become aware of the space you're in and the sensation of your body in that space. Become aware of the other humans holding this space and silently welcome them all here. Tell yourself that just as your voice deserves to be heard, so does theirs. And commit to sharing this space with each other. In the third breath, bring your attention to your body and your breath once again. Inhale deeply. Now release. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass back to Christine.
Thanks, Susanna, for leading us in that exercise. So now let's go into the nuts and bolts of what we're going to learn today. So we're going to learn what are co-ops, and that's going to be a sort of foundational definition. We're going to look at what they do. We're going to look at where in the world they've been found. And we're also going to take a look at the 7 cooperative principles. These are guidelines by which co-ops, which are value-based businesses, put those values into practice. And then we're going to look at the specific ways in which BIPOC communities have engaged with co-ops as a form of survival and resistance. Often, and what we'll see from our examples is BIPOC communities have often used co-ops under very harsh conditions, under conditions that very intentionally and forcibly have been employed to exclude, marginalize, and oppress BIPOC communities. And so co-ops become this alternative method. And I use the word survival and resistance, but I'm also a big fan of the word thriving. And co-ops are a model that BIPOC folk have seen as a way for moving us from surviving to thriving. And so we're going to look at some examples of that in practice. Then I'm going to pass it over to Susanna. We'll hear from her about, well, what are the opportunities that exist right now? If co-ops have been used in this way historically, what relevance do they have now? I mean, I think I'm going to answer the question already. They have lots of relevance now, particularly as we're in a moment in which we face multiple crises that are converging and being exacerbated as we live through a pandemic. Part of that is looking at how, in moving toward these alternatives, we make sure that all voices are at the table and that our focus is on equity and inclusion, particularly in Canada's co-op sector. So let's look at how we'll learn. So the type of learning we'll do is based on the popular education model, was also known as Education for Liberation, and it was developed by a Brazilian educator, Paulo Freire. And so in this space, book learning is great, it's important, but it's also important for us to uplift the fact that ancestral knowledge and lived experience are just as valuable and are to me, more welcome in this space than book learning. And it's about recognizing that we all have deep reservoirs of cultural and ancestral knowledge, and that we have our lived experiences that inform a discussion about how we work together, how we work cooperatively, how we work in ways that, that honor and uplift communities and the planet. Second, I am not the authority on co-ops. I'm not sitting at a podium lecturing everyone. There are a lot of people in this space who have knowledge, skills, stories, and experiences to share. And in that sense, we are each other's co-teacher and we are co-learners. I really like that phrase, each one teach one, and I'd like to bring that into this space. The way we're going to engage that is by creating an active learning community. So we did the grounding exercise. We did the introduction. These are ways that we're bringing everybody into this conversation. And you're going to see more of that throughout this workshop. We're going to have guided visualizations. We're going to have icebreaker questions. We're going to have ways in which we can really live up to those 2 points there, that we are co-teachers, co-learners, and that this is a space that welcomes ancestral and cultural knowledge and lived experience. So that's the how we'll learn. So we hope that you'll be really up and comfortable in joining us in terms of contributing the ways that you feel comfortable contributing. If it's just in the chat, that's welcome here. Or there are times when we might call on you to contribute by turning off your mic and talking, or possibly turning off your camera. Whatever is comfortable for you, we invite you to do so. So we're going to go into one of the ways in which we are co-creating this dynamic and active learning community. And it's going to be an icebreaker question that's starting to get us thinking about co-ops, and co-ops is a community-based model of business. So I'm going to pass it over to Susanna.
Thanks, Christine. So before we get into the question of what are co-ops, what do they do, let's start with an icebreaker. So in this icebreaker, I want you to think about your work life. What has work meant for you, for your family, for your community? Your response can be a word, can be a short phrase, can be however long or short you want. I want you to share your responses in the chat.
Thanks, Susanna. So for example, if I think about my work life, if I think about what it's meant for me, what it's meant for my community, I'm an organic farmer. I farm at a nonprofit out in Guelph called Indigenous Farm. And so work for me has meant being able to provide a source of healthy local food to communities in Guelph. If I had to break that down into one word phrases about what work has meant for me, I'd say words like growth, learning, stability, and community. So I invite you to do the same. Take a moment, think about, I'll say it again, think about your work life. What has it meant for you? What has it meant for your family? And what has it meant for your community? And feel free to drop your answers in the chat, or if anybody's keen, just do the little raise hand function, or turn off your video and raise your hand, and you can let us know what your reflections on that question is. We have Vanessa. Hi, Vanessa. Belonging, community, livelihood. Rav says independence. Eric, empowering people who are marginalized in private businesses and society. Thank you, Eric. Eric was the program director and my teacher at the Co-op Zone Co-op Developers Program. Catherine, work so far has meant stress, alienated labor, regimentation, and hierarchy. Aaron, interesting, fun, and fulfilling. Thomas, obligation, responsibility, survival, accountability. Judith, community building. These are great. I want to make sure I'm getting them all. Hazel, opportunity to learn from committed people in the co-op sector, opportunity to contribute and help empower others. Meg, reason to breathe, empowering myself and others, fixing big problems from Kathy. Hi, Kathy, we have personal challenge. Amy, welcome, Amy, community, teamwork, engaging, supportive. Wow, these are great, keep them coming. Greer, connection, boundaries, contributing to something that continues beyond me. Marianne, one person doesn't have all the answers. That's definitely the co-op spirit, but together as a community, we can find the answers to support everyone. I was co-teacher, Eric says I was co-teacher with Christine, not her teacher. And Eric's teaching style did influence when I spoke about the popular education model and that each of us are co-learners and co-teachers. That is the space that we had with Eric. So thank you, Eric. Susanna, ongoing learning and growth, community, time away from family, and yet opportunities to bring family into work. Heather, learning, community, and opportunity. These are wonderful. Flavie, for me, it's been a lot about self-actualization, growth, and learning. Keep those coming. We've had a lot of responses here. Both people expressing themselves with candor, whether work has meant something positive and enriching for your life, or whether work has meant stress, and alienation. So keep them coming, but we're going to go into, now that we've thought about what work has meant for us, for our communities, let's go into a basic a groundwork definition of what are co-ops and what do they mean for individuals, and what do they mean for individuals within community. So groundwork definition, co-ops, a cooperative is a collectively owned and democratically controlled business or organization. The emphasis on collectively owned and democratic decision-making is what distinguishes co-ops from traditional forms of business. Co-ops often form when members of a community come together to identify and meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations. And an example of that actually is in the picture that I have up there, New Communities. New Communities is a community land trust founded by 12 Black farmers in the 1960s, and it is considered to be the prototype. It is the prototype, the first community land trust in the US. And in this example, those farmers came together they identified an unmet need. Actually, they identified the staggering rates of land loss that Black farmers had been experiencing because of discriminatory policies from the USDA, including the systematic denial of loans to Black farmers. And that led to 12 million acres of farmland lost that was under Black ownership. So New Communities came together to form a community land trust to hold that farmland for the benefit of Black farmers. And the goals were land access. Another goal was secure and affordable housing. They identified that that was an unmet need and endeavored to build housing on their acreage. And also economic empowerment that came from the activities on the land. So when we talk about co-ops, these are the types of goals that cooperators, members of the community, are coming together to collectively address. And they do so by collectively making decisions about how to get there. So that was a groundwork definition. But what does that mean? And we'll go into a little bit into what does it mean for a business model that is collectively owned and run by democratic decision-making. Well, it means that co-ops are owned by the people. So that means the people who own and finance the co-op also use its services. So when we say the people finance the co-op, well, what distinguishes co-ops from traditional businesses is with a traditional business, you know, you might have venture capitalists, private investors, you might get a loan from a bank to start the enterprise. Co-ops will often seek out startup capital from members of the community. And one way that they might employ to do this is by offering membership shares, where members of the community can buy a share into the co-op. And in turn, they receive voting privileges. They receive, they might also receive the surplus or dividends from the co-op's activities. I guess another way to say that is profits. They might be recipients of the profits of the co-op. That point about members having a vote leads into our second point, that co-ops are controlled by the people. So the people who use the co-op, who finance the co-op, who are members or worker owners, they also govern and manage the operations of the co-op. And they do so democratically. And that means one member, one vote. So again, this is what distinguishes co-ops from traditional forms of business, right? Because if I was a fat cat investor and I bought up majority shares in a company, I would have more say in how that business or how that company is run. There would be a hierarchy based on my ability to buy more shares. But in co-ops, as a member, each member has one vote. And so in this sense, we're seeing a business model that runs more non-hierarchically, that runs with more equity and runs more on democratic principles. And finally, co-ops are made for the people. Co-ops exist to serve a community's needs. And with the new communities example, you saw how the farmers came together and they saw that there was this unmet need in their community and they worked together to meet that need. So often with co-ops, some of the most effective ones are actually, they reach out to the community. They're asking the community, well, what is it that we need? Like, for example, if a community doesn't have a grocery store, right? It's a community that experiences a term called food. You might have heard the term food deserts or food apartheid, which means that this neighborhood has intentionally been left without access to a source of healthy fruits, healthy vegetables. A group might come together and say, you know what, this neighborhood needs a co-op grocery store, and work together to meet that need. So that's what we mean when we talk about co-ops being these collectively owned, democratically run businesses. They're businesses that you might have heard the phrase, they're businesses that put people and planet over profits, which is another way that it distinguishes itself from traditional business. A co-op, it's a business, right? So it's to be sustainable, it makes profit. However, being a value-based business, its emphasis is on looking at, well, how do we take care of people and how do we take care of the planet in the decisions that we make about the business? So Susanna, if you go to the next slide, if that's what co-ops are, well, where do these ideas come from? These ideas around a communal and community-focused type of business development. Well, co-ops are rooted in many histories around the globe. Some of the earliest forms of co-op development have been found in India and China. We see the economic basis of African life was originally cooperative. Now you're hearing a lot of people talking about the solidarity economy. This is a phrase that's becoming more common in our discourse, and that can be attributed to people's movements in South America. In the indigenous communities of Turtle Island, cultural patterns of economic cooperation were ingrained in the fabric of every tribe. And then in 19th century Europe, the Rockdale pioneers, they developed a co-op, and in doing so, formulated the prototype for the 7 cooperative principles, which I had mentioned earlier, and we're going to go into a bit more detail about them now. So as you can see, working cooperatively has stemmed from all parts of the globe. And in recounting that people's history, I do really want to give gratitude to Dr. Caroline Shanaz Hussein, whose work in uplifting and recognizing the global history of co-ops and the contributions of BIPOC folk in the cooperative movement was really instrumental in me developing that panel and finding that info about the roots of co-ops. So what are the 7 cooperative principles? So these are the principles you'll find set down by the International Cooperative Association, and they're the principles by which co-ops put their values into practice. So the first principle is voluntary and open membership. You're doing great, Susanna. Is voluntary and open membership, which means that people join of their own will without discrimination. Co-ops being value-based, co-ops taking care of people. That first principle means that individuals won't be denied access to a co-op based on their identities and lived experiences. They also won't be forced to join a co-op, which is another important point. A person joins the co-op because they want to be there, because they want to contribute. Second principle is democratic member control. The people set policy and make decisions. And that's a bit of that democratic decision making that I touched on, 1 member and 1 vote. Third principle is member economic participation. The people decide where the money goes. So as part of that governance by the people, it's the co-op members who get together to make decisions about where those dividends or that surplus or that profit goes. You know, for example, the members of a co-op might decide that the dividends go to co-op members. They might decide that maybe there's a project in their community that those dividends can go to. And we'll see an example of a co-op later where they've used their dividends to pay for holiday hampers, to provide access to food to their communities in that time over the holidays when it's really in need. So we'll go to the 4th economic principle, autonomy and independence. The people control their own and their co-op's destiny. So the co-op members, they come together to really assert the principles of the co-op and just to make sure that those principles are upheld in all of their decision making. This also affects things like who the co-op chooses to bring on as partners or suppliers. And these might be questions of, okay, in our ways of doing business, do we want to make sure that our suppliers or our partners hold values that align with our co-op's mission or with our principles, values and principles as a co-op? So that's autonomy and independence. All of these decisions, or the ability to empower people with making these types of decisions about co-op governance, are rooted in this principle of education, training, and information. Co-ops are invested in educating their members so that they can make those informed decisions about finance and about the governance and even about the structure of the co-op model. Cooperation among cooperatives. I wouldn't say co-ops are really, a characteristic of co-ops are fierce competition. It's more about working together. And here you'll see that the principle, this sixth principle, encourages co-ops to come together to support each other. And I've certainly seen this in the development of this project, Freedom Dreams Co-op. Susanna says Principle 6 is my personal favorite. I mean, I've certainly seen this in the year that I've worked on Freedom Dreams. When I started this alone, and I would often say to people that I feel like a co-operator without cooperators. And over the past year, I've been in search of this support and have received it in droves. And there are folks here today from various co-op organizations who have been very supportive about seeing what we do advance. And then the seventh principle is concern for community. The people care for one another and we stand in solidarity with each other. And I talked about different examples of that already, about how co-ops as a principle and as a value are putting people and planet as a central component in its everyday decision making. So now that we've gone through a basic definition of co-ops, a bit about the history, we've looked at the 7 principles. Now let's do a guided visualization. So what we've gone through so far, we see that in co-ops, we find this alternative way of doing business. So I want to engage your imaginations about what that alternative way of doing business looks like in the everyday. So Susanna's going to lead us in a guided visualization, and this is a way that we're going to engage our imaginations. I mean, this project is called Freedom Dreams, so we'll be doing a lot of dreaming in these workshops, because having a freedom dream, and this is a term that was set down by Robin D.G. Kelly, and he looked at, you know, that radicals, that the Black radicals and Black activists, the work that they did were rooted in imagining these liberating futures that weren't yet present, but it was in the act of imagining them that gave them that creative fuel to fight to bring these futures into existence. So we're going to do a form of that right now, and I'm going to pass it over to Susanna to guide us in this visualization.
Thanks so much, Christine. So I want everyone to bring yourself to a comfortable state, whatever that looks like and feels like for you, whether it's your eyes open or closed, leaning back in your chair or standing up, stretching. Don't get a chance to do that all that much with our Zoom lives. So whatever makes you feel good. Maybe sitting on the carpet or even laying on the couch, wherever you might be. Now I want you to take a deep breath. And imagine that the way in which you work has been radically transformed. You now spend 8 hours a day, 5 days a week in a fair and just workplace, one that is both equitable and inclusive. What does the workspace look like? Imagine the physical elements of the space and the impact of those elements on your well-being. Who are your coworkers? How do they treat each other? How do the bosses treat the workers? How are the decisions made? How much are you paid? How does everyone feel about the work that they're doing? How does the community benefit from the work that you're doing? When you go home and are asked, how was work today? What do you say? Take a moment to think and breathe and write down in the chat or write wherever you may want to write. Simply just bring your mind to your answers. Let's take a moment for that. You can feel free to when you're ready. Write your responses in the chat. You can choose to raise your hand and we'll call on you to either share video or audio if you like, whatever you're comfortable with. We'll take a few moments for that. So our first share here from Catherine, thank you. Catherine says, oh, there we go. Happy, motivated, but calm, no bosses, fully staffed, glad to see my coworkers, prepared, well-rested. I like the well-rested. Meg says, workspace is colorful, full of energy and life. There are families welcome and animals welcome. People are smiling and happy. The workplace is indistinguishable from a warm, healthy, happy home. People feel supported and heard and participative in their work. Thanks for sharing. And Eric says, encouraging and hopeful to see people who are frustrated in traditional workplaces flourish. And Rachel shares with us, balancing ownership over your labor and collaboration with people who are equally invested and interested. Hazel says, supportive, empowering, feels like a healthy family. Judith says, my workplace would be a total creative space with encouraging cooperative colleagues. Thomas says, mentorship learning, egalitarian, purposeful. Greer says, I see a workplace where I'm a part of a collective of people who want to approach the work with a lens of understanding and empathy, who are daring, truly courageous in taking action. I engage with many people every day and I make a positive difference in their day. I have time to feel grounded in my own life and feel supported financially, and so do all my coworkers. That like encompasses everything. I love it. And there's no right or wrong answers here, right? Like the way that we're sharing in a few words and how it, looks like, feels like, all of that is just so valuable. Some really great answers here. Amy says a flat hierarchy where everyone feels respected and comfortable raising issues. That's important. Grassroots, anti-capitalist, sustainable workplace that honors people and the earth. There's enough time to get everything done in a way that respects people's talent, energy, ability, and availability. I agree, Meg. Greers, that sounds so good. Vanessa says, I'm imagining a work environment that would allow for more flow in and out of projects as energy builds, peaks, and ebbs. Focus and energy shifts through phases of our lives as we learn. Yeah, that's great. I also love that too, Vanessa. Thanks so much for sharing. I'm going to turn it over to Christine for the next parts. But I feel like if you just want to keep on sharing in the chat, this is also just wonderful to be able to share with each other. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Yes, and keep them coming in the chats, because if we have time at the end of the workshop, we could read out some more of these visualizations. So we just imagined this radically transformed workplace. Why was it important? Why is it important for us to start thinking about radical transformation in the spaces that we inhabit? Well, because we find ourselves again in a time and a place that requires radical transformation. We're living through a time of acute crises. And as these multiple crises we currently face converge and are exacerbated during this time of pandemic, the climate crisis, assaults on democracy, racial injustice, rising food insecurity, precariousness of work, the lack of affordable housing. These crises, which Black and Indigenous communities and low-income communities, communities of color, have already been most impacted by. We're seeing the ways in which our communities are being impacted even more. And so we're asking, well, first we're questioning the current systems that brought us here, this exploitative and extractive capitalism, and its impact on people and planet. And so a lot of us, as these discussions start happening about a return to normal, there are those of us who are saying, well, normal wasn't good enough, normal was broken. And so we're looking for alternative systems that take care of us, that allows us to take care of each other and take care of the planet. So when we talk about co-ops and the solidarity economy, we find that historically BIPOC communities have turned to co-ops as one among a whole toolkit of approaches that help to navigate these particular crises we face. And so in this next portion of the workshop, we're going to look at some of those particular ways that BIPOC communities have employed co-ops as a means to navigate those crises. So I'm going to start with a quote. I think we're missing oh, if you go back to the slide, previous slide, Susanna. So I want to take this quote from this book, Collective Courage, that really sets the groundwork for what we're going to be seeing in these examples. And if you haven't heard about this book, it's called Collective Courage, A History of African-American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice. And it was written by Dr. Jessica Gordon Nemhard, who's a professor and a thought leader on cooperative economics. And with Collective Courage, she is the first to document the history of African Americans in the cooperative movement, a documentation that had been sorely missing from the history of cooperatives in the United States. And so Dr. Nemhard writes, African Americans, as well as other people of color and low-income people, have benefited greatly from cooperative ownership and democratic economic participation throughout the history of the United States, much like their counterparts around the world. So in our examples that follow, we're going to look at those ways in which it has benefited people of color around the world. So for BIPOC communities, co-ops have been a means of resilience during crisis. I'm going to read another quote from Dr. Nemhard's book. Cooperative efforts in the early part of the 20th century illuminate the perseverance of African Americans in finding alternative economic strategies to promote economic stability and economic independence in the face of fierce competition, racial discrimination, and white supremacist violence and sabotage. The examples that follow and the ways that co-ops have been formed among BIPOC communities around the globe, you could take African Americans and you can put many different lived experiences in there to talk about the ways in which our communities have looked to alternative strategies in order to navigate competition, sure, but competition in the face of racial discrimination and white supremacist framework that is meant to marginalize and disenfranchise our communities. So next slide. Co-ops have been a means of exercising economic and political freedom. And I want to talk about that point by talking about Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer was an American civil rights activist. She founded Freedom Farm Cooperative, which was an agricultural cooperative, in 1969. She formed it out of necessity. She was fired from her job and had her land and property confiscated. She was a sharecropper. Her and her husband were sharecropping on a white landowner's, on the property of a white landowner. And he basically gave her an ultimatum. If you want to keep your job and your property, don't vote. And so that was no choice for Fannie Lou Hamer. And that was actually a tactic in the US that white landowners used a lot to try to keep Black citizens from voting. And so Fannie Lou Hamer decided to register to vote. And in registering to vote, she had to overcome a lot of other obstacles to even get there. And she formed Freedom Farm Cooperative in response. She bought 40 acres, received economic support to buy 40 acres, and set out the co-op's mission and values, which was to improve nutrition, provide affordable housing, and to open up entrepreneurship opportunities for Black Americans. For Hamer, that link between land and exercising political freedom was land ownership and exercising political freedom was key. Not only because of the context that she came out of, that she experienced, but also she saw the ways in which ownership of land created the conditions for self-sufficiency and were very directly tied to the freedom to register to vote. Hamer was politically active throughout her entire life. She would go on to co-found the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the National Women's Political Caucus, and she ran for the US Senate and the Mississippi State Senate. So in the next slide, I want to talk just a little bit more, put a little bit more of a finer point on that link between understanding how participating in a democratic business structure like co-ops can actually tie in and support co-op members' civic and political participation in a democratic society. This is a quote from a keynote that Maurice Mitchell, who's the national director of the Working Families Party, and that's a progressive political party in the US that advances the cause of a multiracial working class movement. And Maurice was the keynote at the 2020 Worker Co-op Conference, which I attended virtually. And he delivered an amazing keynote. And in it, he said, when everyday working class people are at the table in their workplace, making decisions about how those workplaces best meets the needs for the many and not the privileged few at the top, it's preparing working people to lead in all segments of life. The type of democracy you engage in daily can be scaled to transform society. So in this, we find co-ops as a means of empowering that sort of civic and political participation by way of the fact that every single day that you go to work, you are engaging in a democratic decision-making process. For BIPOC communities, co-ops have been formed as a means of mobilizing against racial violence and exclusion. And here I want to use the example of Japanese Canadian fishing cooperatives that existed on Canada's Pacific coast for more than 40 years. From the beginning of the 20th century to 1942, Japanese fishing cooperatives were successful and they made important contributions to establishing Canada's fishing industry. They were formed in response to the anti-Asian racism that Asian Canadians faced in this country. How that played out in terms of the fishing industry is Japanese Canadian fishers, they were excluded from the economic advantages and protections that white fishers received. And they were also denied membership in fishing cooperatives that were predominantly included the membership of white fishers. So Japanese Canadians created these cooperatives as a means of advancing themselves against a racial policies that were intended to hold them down. These co-ops also had an additional function in that they became the financial support that allowed Japanese Canadian communities to provide themselves with the services that they were systematically denied by the Canadian government. And these services were the basic rights of citizenship, right? Like basic healthcare and access to educational opportunities. So being forcibly denied those things, these Japanese Canadian co-ops became this sort of, financial support for communities give those things to themselves. I'm going to read this quote: Japanese Canadians exercise agency to survive marginalization in Canada. Like other immigrant groups, they drew on pre-existing knowledge from home communities and adapted this knowledge to their new homeland. That point about bringing knowledge from home and applying it to a Canadian context is very important, because Japanese Canadian cooperatives, they weren't officially incorporated. They basically ran off of the ways that communal fishing carried itself out in Japan. And those fishers took those principles and brought them to the Canadian context to create this hybrid model. And that's really important to understanding how BIPOC communities have formed co-ops in Canada. Bringing the traditional and cultural ways of working cooperatively from their homelands and creating this hybrid with the resources and the conditions they find in Canada. Unfortunately, in the co-op histories that we're told about cooperative development in Canada, that very fact is often overlooked, because these co-ops, they did not hit the official definitions of what it means to have a cooperative business. But they are very important to acknowledge and recognize if we're going to talk about bringing all voices to the table in forming this alternative economic system. I mentioned that these fishing co-ops were wildly successful until about 1942. Well, what happened in 1942? World War II and the internment of Japanese Canadians. So when that happened, the Canadian government interned the Japanese Canadians and confiscated their property. So that picture you see is actually of a Japanese Canadian fisherman sitting on his boat just hours before his boat was confiscated. So co-ops for BIPOC communities have been a means of creating equitable and just work. I love this example. I'm going to use the example of Brightly Co-ops. Brightly Co-ops is a domestic services co-op in the US. It started in New York, and it's really looking to branch out. Brightly Co-op's co-op members are primarily Latinx women. Latinx women are becoming the predominant ethnic group that participates in the domestic service industry. You can argue that it is less because of opportunity and more because of a host of factors, including gender discrimination, class, immigration status, and race, that kind of makes domestic service work one of the few viable options for low-income Latinx women. As an industry, it's characterized by very poor pay. Most domestic service workers make about $11 an hour. It's a job with little to no benefits and very erratic and last-minute schedules, which make it hard for working mothers. Brightly formed as a way for Latinx women to create equitable and just workspace. As Meg is saying, and yet the most important job in the world, absolutely. So they created Brightly Co-op to improve their working conditions. And you'll see from that quote that their worker owners generally make around $21 per hour, decide collectively how much of their pay they want to leave in the co-op for expenses and how much they want to take home. As a collective, they also implement benefits like paid time off. This co-op's actually also expanding. It's turning into a franchise. And in that, they're also wanting to apply co-op principles to what again can often be low pay, erratic schedules, long hours that we find in franchises in the service industry. They're also launching an app, or they launched an app. And again, they're trying to create the means for an equitable and better work conditions, better paying work conditions. Because as you know, from gig economy apps, they often charge these exorbitant usage fees that really cut into their users' paychecks. So that is what Brightly Co-op's endeavoring to do. So we're at 7:02. I want to give Susanna ample time for her part of the presentation. So I'm going to go through my final 2 points, the ways in which BIPOC communities have employed co-ops, pooling resources to meet collective needs. And I'm going to use the example of Roscas among, and honestly, I feel like Roscas, it's about a women's form of economic empowerment, because you find this used by women all over the world. Africa, the Caribbean, Pakistan, China, Korea, Mexico, all through the global South, you see Roscas being employed. They're informal savings collectives in which these members come together, they contribute a set amount, and in turn, they take from the pot in order to meet their needs. And so there's actually some great research being done by Dr. Carolyn Shanaz-Hossain about the banker ladies, is what they're lovingly called. And again, these women are employing these Roscas often because of their experiences with racial discrimination within mainstream banking institutions. And here you see, I got this from an article from the Globe, this particular banker lady saying so many of the women she worked with lost their jobs and their income, and they turned to their Roscas so that they can support their families. And so many of us needed things we could no longer get to support our families. Whatever we did went straight into our group for survival. And then finally, co-ops have been a means, thank you, Susanna, rotating savings credit associations. And my last example in the ways that co-ops, what they've meant for BIPOC communities, meeting needs in underserved communities. I don't want to talk about Many Nations, which is a financial services co-op. It is 100% Indigenous owned, and when it cooperated, it became the first national Indigenous co-op in Canada. It started because its founder recognized that First Nation teachers weren't getting the same benefits as non-Indigenous teachers, and there weren't many financial services at that time that were willing to give those benefits to First Nations individuals. So that's how Many Nations was founded to meet that need. When it started to share dividends with its co-op members, well, from that time, which is about 2011 till now, it's shared out in excess of 1 million in dividends. And the co-op members in turn have decided what to do with that. And this is the example I was talking about, where co-op members, they've decided that, that they want to use that money to provide holiday hampers to First Nations, to their First Nations communities. And they've also used those dividends for things like local school repair. So I just want to give a quick with gratitude to the co-op thought leaders who really empowered me with this knowledge about BIPOC contributions to the co-op movement. Dr. Gordon Nemhard, Collective Courage, Dr. Shanaz-Hossain and her essay, particularly locating the contributions of the African diaspora in the Canadian co-op sector. Joanne Lee and her colleagues who wrote about Japanese Canadian fishing co-ops. I also want to shout out to the US Solidarity Economy Network for their Solidarity Economy 101, which I attended and just was fantastic. And also I just want to acknowledge that this workshop series is made possible by a grant that I received from the Guelph Wellington Our Food Future program and their Urban Agriculture Challenge. So now I'm going to flip it over to Susanna, who is going to talk about her journey with co-ops and what are the opportunities that exist so that we can create this burgeoning alternative economic system that truly includes all voices at the table.
Wow. Thank you, Christine. Honestly, I feel like I've learned so much from you, and there's so many incredible examples that you just used. then I feel like I'm going to look up some more of these resources that you have left here for a little bit more background. So yes, thank you so much. And I'm going to start off just by talking a little bit about myself and my journey and how I got to be here. So I'm just going to start with how my journey really started with food. So I love food. And I love eating, cooking, growing. Food's one of the things that just connects all of us, and it crosses through so many different barriers and policy divisions, but it's also inherently political. So you can't really separate food from the environment where it's grown, and the people who produce it and move it, the circumstances in which they are affected by their relationship to food. How often do we think about who feeds those who feed us? Our migrant farm workers who have no access to healthcare, no human rights, no recourse, no status. Our frontline workers and grocery clerks who have not had the privilege to stay home when it's been mandated during this whole pandemic, who've had to choose between their health and a paycheck, which means the roof over their heads. Thinking about who decides, how is it decided, and who has access to the healthy, nourishing food. And also because I believe in justice and equity. Especially with food being so politically charged, I believe in systems that need to be just, equitable, diverse, inclusive. These principles apply to the human rights and dignity that I believe we all deserve to be able to show each other and to be shown. Sometimes this means using my words and actions to stand up for causes and people with less privilege than myself. Sometimes it means supporting and uplifting others with the tools I've learned in order to create their own futures. As we've seen from Christine's presentation, co-ops are ways in which to bring more power, more autonomy to communities which have been historically targeted, disenfranchised, not having to rely on these systems that are designed to decimate and systemically oppress. And also, I want to contribute to a real future for my own kids. Also, like, I have my kids in the background, so in case you hear a little bit of rumble in the back, that's definitely them. And one of my greatest wishes really is to make sure that the world that they live in by the time they're middle-aged is still here, and they still have hope. There's still beauty in the world. And in order to do that, we need to really be talking about climate justice, sustainability for the future. These elements are necessary for this conversation because without it, nothing else makes sense. Co-ops are resilient business models catering to the needs of their membership and have the triple bottom line of people, planet, and profit. They're prioritizing the environmental sustainability and also long-term thinking. So in my background, I mentioned before that I've been working in co-ops for about 10 years. I have been in all different kinds of co-ops and entangled with them at every turn. I live in a housing co-op. I was one of the coordinators starting up the West End Food Co-op retail store when it started, and I was there on the last day when it finished and closed. And I've been working in cooperatives for I think about 11 years now. But also at one point we had co-founded a childcare co-op for one of our kids. And also my children have been a part of dance co-ops. And I just really feel that this model has so much potential in many different ways, in many different situations. And it's interesting because with my work in co-ops, often I'm at conferences, and I just kept on seeing this pattern of, looking around for other folks that look like me, or others that, just trying to find where all the BIPOC folks are at, which is interesting because the cooperative is started because of a need, and a need of membership from something that's not being met. And so many different types of marginalized communities have many different kinds of needs that need to be met. So there's got to be some other thing happening that I'm just not sure about or not aware of. And so it's interesting too for me to be able to see that there are a lot of these highly successful uses of the co-op model. And while there's also a lot of small startups that struggle. So there's this discrepancy with this diversity between co-op service providers some of the larger conglomerates, the federated co-ops, the credit unions, which are predominantly white. And then also you see the members and patrons of, say, my housing co-op, where you have a lot more racialized people. But also I'm thinking through, it makes me think about this spectrum of cooperatives and how, where is that possibility for upward mobility within that? So being able to make the more accessible for a wider pool of co-op members to be able to also see successes in various different cooperative ways. So as I was wrestling with questions about what steps to take in my career personally, and I'm considering going back to school, which I feel like I actually maybe didn't mention, but I'm also a master's student at York University in the Department of Environment and Urban Change. And I'm also looking with my research at the intersections of BIPOC food sovereignty, cooperatives, and climate justice. And so as I was considering going back to school and thinking about different things, this is when the COVID crisis hit. And at work, we saw co-op members pivoting, closing, expanding, changing up their model to really meet the need of their members. And that resilience has been quite incredible to be able to see how that has been able to really provide their members with what they need. And also quickly, because, as we all know, when the COVID crisis hit, we had no time to prepare. We were just thrown into it. But we saw a spike in this interest in co-ops as people began to realize the systems that they held so close and dear were failing them. Actually, for a lot of BIPOC folks, these systems were already failing, and they had been for generations, because capitalism is built upon structural racism and requires a body of people to exploit in order to function. Historically and today, this is on the backs of BIPOC peoples, from enslaved peoples, Indigenous peoples, and it's so ingrained in the systems that we hold to be true. Because our collective memories are so short, it's hard to remember that things were not always like this. COVID has presented an opportunity to think differently about our present and about our future. And more people are standing together against injustices and looking to each other to think about how we move forward sustainably. So now that we, recognize and see that things need to change, how is that going to work? We need systems change, but not half-hearted measures. And I'm going to give you an example. I couldn't find something that I was trying to explain in this, so I just made this one over here. So thinking about inclusivity versus progress. We think about the example of diversity hire. So right now we're in a place where a lot of companies and organizations are recognizing we need to be able to diversify. We need more people of color. We need more visibility. How do we do this? How do we be more inclusive? But the problem is if they don't actually change their structure to be able to accommodate for that, it's just going to have the same cycle over and over. So here with this diversity hire, while it's a move in the right direction, the reason it does not work well is because if you create a position for diversity within an organization that hasn't changed or accommodated that structure, the position is set up for failure. So do people want progress or do they want to just be inclusive? And here's why this isn't the same. So we have this process here where a diversity hire will enter the company. They're hired for visibility with little impactful power, right? So quite often the front lines, but they aren't really given that decision-making power. And an issue inevitably will arise because of the stagnant structure and they end up being labeled as problematic, or something will happen in that sort of sense. Where there's no proper recourse when something does inevitably come up. And without that substantial, change, it's going to lead to conflict and lead to tension. Eventually, the diversity hire will leave, and then the company will wonder why, again, they can't retain BIPOC workers. If there's no impact on the business and no decision-making power, then it's not really going to make meaningful change. It's also a fallacy to rely on one single person to represent the vast diversity of a category of people. This othered opposition to whiteness and the status quo within this structure of previously existing staff members have seen as that previously working, inevitably when something different arises, it's going to be blamed on the thing that's different. And the person that came in is going to be the one that's different. So this is part of why, without the way you need to be able to consider the cooperative model. And when we build co-ops with democratic ownership and decision-making power, then, and include everybody within that, then that's a way to be able to bring real change to the face of different companies and organizations. I'm going to the next one. So co-ops as solutions. As co-ops are created for members and by members, this fosters a model of self-determination, of having more decision-making power and autonomy for BIPOC communities and products, services that are for BIPOC communities and by them. Part of my work at LFFC is supporting new co-ops in their development. And I've walked through the process with a number of BIPOC co-ops. Many of them drop off, and I really want to understand what this is about. Is it the lack of accessible language? Is it diversity? Is it about seeing oneself in the sector? Is it financial barriers or time barriers? And we're not the only ones who are experiencing this. We've heard from experts in the co-op sector in the field, both provincially and nationally, both Christine and I, that this drop-off is a common threat. And we're at a place right now where we need to rethink those structures and systems, not simply bring more BIPOC co-ops into the same existing frameworks they don't see themselves. So like this diversity hire, instead, we're working towards deconstructing, decolonizing our ways of thinking and creating methods of engagement to reach more people who are yearning for something beyond the broken systems they see as failing them. And for those who don't yet know how the cooperative model could possibly work for them. So what are we going to do about it? So we know these histories of BIPOC co-ops, past and present. We have tools available to us to help develop and to support new startup cooperatives. We know that people are itching for change. We know that folks know that there's more out there than what they've tried and are ready for more involvement in ways that prioritize people, profit, and planet. The first step is getting the word out there, is bring people together to think through new ways to cooperate and to bring about change led by BIPOC communities. This webinar here today that you guys are at is one of 3 in this Freedom Dreams webinar series designed to educate and spark interest in the growing capacity of folks wanting to make change, wanting to start working towards more cooperatives that are inclusive, diverse, and might not look like all the others that are put up front and center when you Google the word co-op. So we're interested in you and for us to be able to grow this movement and to grow Freedom Dreams as well too. So we have big dreams for Freedom Dreams. There's needs identified such as, need more co-op developers. We need more supports to support them. We need more resources to tell these stories of co-op education, those stories that have been erased from history. When we're talking about transformation on our own terms, when we talk about decolonizing, we're thinking through processes of new ways of operating, of outreach, and working together. So, these are not buzzwords to gain points on grants. It's things to be able to really think about how that's something different we can utilize in moving this progress forward. Want to also just make a plug for our next workshops as well too, if you haven't signed up for them yet, that we have some excellent speakers who are going to be joining us. Wednesday, October 13th, we're going to have Victor Beausoleil from CETC, who's an incredible speaker and just so very inspiring with the work that he's doing. They're doing with CETC. That's for Co-ops for Liberation, the role of co-ops in fighting for social justice. And in November, we also have Anand Lololi from African Food Basket and Black Food Sovereignty Toronto, talking about Black food sovereignty and the cooperative model in the Nourishing Belonging episode as well too. So we definitely want you guys to be able to come and join us for those.
Thanks, Susanna. And I also want to mention, we do have a 4th workshop that we're thinking of a 2022 date. So when people come back from the Christmas holidays, we have Josephine Gray, who is the from St. Jamestown Community Co-op and the EcoJust Food Network, who is going to speak, and a plethora of other organizations which she's co-founded over the years to empower low-income and racialized communities. in Toronto. And Heather is saying she's doing a placement with St. James Co-op. Joe is great. She is.
Fantastic.
And so, yes, Joe will join us for a workshop on how to empower and enliven communities through the co-op models. So stay tuned for that. When we get our 2022 date, we will start promoting and offering tickets to that workshop.
Absolutely. And we have a little bit of time now, and we wanted to be able to open up the Q&A a little bit. You know, if you are someone that's here attending who is a BIPOC person who's looking to start a co-op, or if you have a co-op or co-op things in mind, you know, we want to be able to hear, like, what are your ideas? What do you need for support? What do you think that the whole sector is in need of at this time? You know, you can feel free to raise your hand. You can feel free to write in the chat. Whatever you guys would like to be able to choose to do.
Susanna, I also want to add, because this is a co-teaching and co-learning space, we have a lot of people in the room who have decades of experience with co-ops and who are from some of our national and provincial organizations. So also, we want to hear from you in terms of if there's any questions out there about co-ops or developing co-ops or resources to our allies in the room from those organizations. Please feel free to answer or share. Oh, wait, we do have a question from Sahar. What are the most beneficial transformations to implement to support a positive BIPOC experience in co-ops? That's a great question. I think that for me to answer that, it is about that workplace culture. I think for me in my work life, some of the most alienating experiences have been those microaggressions that as Black BIPOC folk we deal with in the workplace, and doubly not having that understood or acknowledged when we do raise issue and are vocal about the ways in which our workplaces make us uncomfortable. And when I say microaggressions, you know, sometimes we treat discrimination and racism with capital D's and capital R's, but it's those everyday microaggressions we experience, and that requires a cultural shift in workplaces so that those are recognized and that the workplace as a collective is actively engaged in seeing them when they arise and proactively dealing with them. So I'd say that if we're talking about, when we talk about co-ops, if we're talking about democracy and all voices at the table, then it's about laying the foundation where you're laying out your cooperative mission and values and getting all your papers together, that is actually an important part of the co-op development as well. Which is that JEDI, the justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion framework that informs the company culture, the co-op culture.
Yeah, I would say to add on to that as well too, like the flexibility in the workplace, and just I think everyone understanding that it's a learning experience, and nothing's ever going to be finished or perfect. You don't go through a process and say, okay, we're decolonized, that's great, we're good now. You know, like these are ongoing things that we need to be revisiting and having those conversations, being comfortable with being uncomfortable, and having, you know, conversations that are going to be tough, but that's okay. And knowing that, like, you know, if you misstep, if you make a mistake, if you're called out on something, that's an opportunity for you to reflect. And it's not saying you're a bad person and we don't like you here. I think having the resilience to be able to know that, you know, to build trust, and if this is what I'm saying, is really a big part of that, and being able to learn how to actively listen, which I think is something we're not really taught. but actively listening to other people when they're talking about, their story and what they need from others. I think that's really important. But yeah, thanks for your question. I see Thomas's question here. That's why I was smiling. Interested in the overlap of co-ops and land trusts. So I have a bit of an answer to this. Did you want to take it? Anything first, Christine?
No, please go ahead.
So yeah, Thomas, I also volunteer with the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust and here in my neighborhood. And also we do have on our team of local food and farm co-ops, we do have one of our coordinators who has a farm co-op, worker co-op on land trust land. And it's definitely interesting to be able to see what the land trust, there's many different pieces to it, but having ways in which community owned land is achievable, it takes a lot of work. And to think it depends upon where you're situated. But there's definitely some models that I can send you to be able to look at. And here in Parkdale, for example, the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust was founded in 2014. And I believe it was 2017, I think, or 2018, they achieved securing their very first parcel of community owned land, which is a community garden that was specifically started for a group of Tibetan elders who didn't have access to growing space, living in apartment buildings, but coming from Nepal, where they had lots of land and grew food. And so the space now will be in perpetuity for these growers, for these farmers, and used for community-owned space. Now, additionally, they're also have owned and been able to achieve with the support of the city as well too, some funding to be able to have their very first rooming house as well. But yeah. I recognize also it is 7:30. So yeah, for anyone that does have to jump off, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. But I'm also open to staying for a little longer should there be more questions that we want to be able to answer, if that's good with everyone.
Thanks, everybody. And Susanna, if you could flip to the last slide where people can get our contact information. So please follow us at Freedom Dreams Co-op, or any questions, you can reach out at our email, freedomdreamscoop@gmail.com. Also take a look at the chat. Hazel from the Canadian Worker Co-op Federation is writing that there's funding available to support co-op development services and capitalization to worker co-ops. We are keen to make these programs known to BIPOC-led groups. So please visit that link for the Canadian Worker Co-op Federation. Yeah, and thank you everybody for joining us for our first workshop. We look forward to seeing you at the next one with Victor Beausoleil talking about co-ops for liberation, and then join us again in November for Anand Laloli, who will talk about co-ops and farming. So yeah, if you need to jump off, have a great rest of the evening. As Susanna said, we'll stick around for a few more minutes if people have any follow-up questions. Thanks, everybody.